So so this morning we started talking a little bit about the question of the Anthropocene, and maybe we can have a bit of a discussion of that. But what I wanted to do right now is just spend maybe half an hour or something like that to introduce this argument in relation to the core focus of this course, which is food and food systems. No, we can, of course, which is an important angle both in talking about the Anthropocene and also talking about capitalism, which is going to be the theme for next week, right? And in fact, if you look at food systems, these two aspects are virtually inseparable, right? Because on the one hand, the commercialization of agriculture and the creation of a global capitalist food economy is one of the most important drivers behind our entering into the Anthropocene, right? As you probably know, banally speaking, not only is the food economy responsible for interruptions in things like the nitrogen cycle and water consumption, all these sorts of things, but also cows and cow farts are one of the most important sources of methane, which is an important.
Have you ever watched Cowspiracy? Yeah, I really recommend it.
What is it?
Cowspiracy. Yeah, it's a documentary.
So there's a very strong connection between these two things. And so where do you stop? So okay, so so this sort of takeoff that we discussed this morning about how at a certain point the impact of human civilization on the planetary environment begins to skyrocket in a certain sense, right? Particularly after the Second World War. It of course is strictly linked to food and the transformation of the food economy. And the transformation of the food economy is a fundamental precondition for the development of modern industrial capitalism. Right? So one of the most important things that need to happen before you can have urbanization and before you can have industry and before you can have an urban working class is that you need to find a way to feed these people. Right? A pre-modern agricultural economy is essentially marked by scarcity. Right? You have this Malthusian paradox that if you have an increase in agricultural production, then this will lead to population increase, and then it will lead to come back to food scarcity. So there's a sort of a Malthusian trap which you can't really get out of. Right? And if you look at the situation around the 18th century around the world, right, you have a number of centers of pre-industrial production or industrious production, right, of fairly advanced craft-based economies, right? China, for example, China in the 18th century is at the level of, or perhaps beyond Europe, in terms of technological development, the development of markets, the use of things like paper money, trade, commerce, transportation, etc. No, it's not an advanced pre-industrial economy. But China, as well as Europe at this time, is sort of stuck in the Malthusian trap. Right? It doesn't really manage to get out of that, right? So you can only have very slow and gradual economic development because you have to keep sort of you're always limited by the availability of food and the availability of calories. Right? The way in which this is solved in the case of Europe is through colonial expansion. Right? So one of the first things that happened in already in the 15th, 16th century is that England, more than anything else, begins to globalize food production. Right? So instead of simply relying on, well, there are of course developments also in England itself, right? So in England in the 16th century onwards, you have a gradual commercialization of agriculture. So you have a process where landlords are okay. Have to stream after because we're already streaming here. Okay. So you have a process where these so in the medieval economy in England you had common lands which were very important because these were the lands that everybody in the village could use to hunt small game, graze some animals, gather some firewood, etc. Right? And there's a process starting with the Tudors, but sort of accelerating in the 17th and 18th century, where these common lands are privatized. Right? So landlords or aristocratic landlords are taking them over, and they're using them for the commercial agricultural production, either wool, which is the big thing in the late Middle Ages, but towards the early modern period, increasingly wheat. Right? So you start growing wheat on these common lands to feed a growing urban population. But this is still not really enough, right? So one of the real advances offered by colonization is the plantation economy and sugar. Right? So essentially by the 18th century, England is creating a system, the so-called triangular trade, whereby you have sugar plantations in the Caribbean worked by African slaves that create sugarcane, which is then imported into England as cheap calories for the working class. And so at a certain point in the late 18th, early 19th century, the diet of the English working class changes, right? From having been, there's an expression in English, old English expression, which is buttering the parsnips, right? Which means contributing, right? So what you're doing ain't really buttering the parsnips, right? So, because people ate parsnips, right? You know what parsnips are? Parsnips is a sort of white carrot in between the carrot and parsley roots. Like you don't really have parsnips in Italy, but that was people ate tubers, right? Parsnips, carrots, Pastanac, yeah. Ma pastanac sono carote in pugliese. No, it's not celery, it's a different, but anyways. So people ate like these roots and gruel, right? And a bit of meat once in a while, probably, right?
Chirivia in Spanish. It's a kind of carrot.
So this sort of stuff, and basically things that were grown in the, and of course bread, or bread in England, rather beer, because wheat was mainly consumed as beer in Italy. The English individual in the 17th century, the average consumption was 3 liters of beer a day, men, women, and children. Right? So everybody drank a lot of beer. And you had, English 17th century breakfast was beer soup, which is essentially boiled beer with some eggs and other things in it. Right? So that was the way in which you consumed wheat more than bread, beer. So that's stuff. But then in the early 19th century, this is transformed. The stuff that we now know about the English diet are established. So the working classes begin to eat biscuits, sweet tea, sandwiches with marmalade, and of course, rum, gin, and other distilled spirits, right? The Industrial Revolution in England was a very alcoholic affair, right? It was to a large extent fueled by the mass production and sale and consumption of distilled spirits. And alcoholism was a very big problem. And if you read Dickens, for example, you see this, that there is this sort of omnipresent threat of gin, and you know, and also people believe that you could spontaneously catch fire if you drink too much gin. So there is this terror of self-combustion which happened. I think there is one yes, in one of the big Dickens novels, I think Tom Sawyer, I think it's his mother died from self-combustion, flaring up like an advertisement for Gordon's gin. So this is, of course, an important part of this type of stepping into the modern world, is breaking this Malthusian condition through, first, of course, the globalization of calorie production. And as we mentioned also this morning, the big step in this direction is, of course, what happens in the aftermath of the Second World War through the so-called Green Revolution. Right? And the Green Revolution is essentially a combination of our chemical fertilizer, agricultural machinery, and along with that, the promotion of standardized crops, because standardized crops are important, because if you use agricultural machinery, you need to have crops that can easily be harvested by a machine, right? The friends that we have here in southern Chilento who make these pre-industrial grains, which is a big thing now, right? Which is supposed to be more nutritious and also more ethical and all these things, but they're also extremely labor intensive, because if you go into one of these fields of pre-industrial grains, you'd see that the grain is going to be at different heights, right? So you need to harvest it manually, right? You can't really use a tractor. So that's the standardization of these things are extremely important. Also cotton, for example, cotton changed enormously after the 1960s from being a crop that needed to be harvested at hand to being a crop which is essentially all at the same height and where you can just harvest it. And with this, of course, also comes capital concentration, because if you have standardization and if you can then use expensive agricultural machinery which runs on diesel oil, then of course people who can afford this machinery will have an advantage in relation to others. So that means that you tend to get the replacement of sort of small-scale family farms with large capital-intensive farms, right? And this, of course, has happened in the US Midwest, and it's also been the consequence to a large extent of this green revolution in places like India, for example.
This is also a case that Landon Wiener makes when he talks about the introduction of the tomato harvester in the US and kind of havoc that he wreaked within the realm of like family-run businesses and concentrating capital in the hands of like a handful of big corporations that can afford the tomato harvester.
Well, the consequence, of course, is this, that you have a transformation, and there are extremely many consequences on this. I mean, the social level, as Ramon said, you have a transformation of the sort of the makeup of the agricultural economy, so that you have, I mean, if you had a number of small to mid-sized firms, now you get a small number of very large firms, large farms, and that use expensive machinery and that are heavily indebted, because most of these farmers are rely on borrowing a lot of money in order to get the type of machinery that will keep them abreast of the competition. And since everybody is doing this, the system tends to produce much more of a particular crop, which means that the prices go down, which means that they earn less, which means that they need to invest in even more technology to keep up, which means that they have to borrow more. Right? So if you take, for example, the example of chicken farming, as we talked about before. So chickens used to be something that people ate on particular occasions. In Europe, it was like a Sunday dish, roast chicken. Right? Now there is a mountain of chicken in the world. There's more chicken is produced than can possibly be consumed. Right? So this leads to, particularly in the United States, and this leads to things like they always give you chicken. If you fly on an American airline, they always give you chicken. And it also leads to these monstrosities, like Kentucky Fried Chicken launched this burger, which was made by, instead of bread, it had 2 pieces of fried chicken breast and then a hamburger in the middle. And it was like the epitome of this thing. Like chicken is actually cheaper than bread. And how did it become this way? Well, because in the 60s, 70s, you start growing chicken in this sort of industrial scale with large chicken farmers. The chickens that are being grown are going through a very rapid selection process. So it's not yet genetical manipulation, but they're being selected to grow very quickly. So the chickens that are being grown are now, they are reaching full size in about 30 days. And often they have oversized breasts, right, because the breast is the most valuable meat. And they're usually big so that they can't really stand up. Right? So they're just like essentially selected to be, machines for transforming corn into meat. And of course, fed corn, which is also another crop that has been selectively bred and genetically manipulated lately, in order to grow very quickly, grow at a height where it can be harvested in a very standardized way, and being resistant to certain pesticides. Right? So, for example, Monsanto has a pesticide called Roundup, which basically kills everything. And it also grows cells of corn, which is genetically manipulated to be resistant to Roundup. Right? So you can only use Roundup together with that corn. Right? And also, of course, corn farmers in that sense have to become very dependent on these companies, because on the one hand, you have to buy these seeds, you have to buy the pesticide. When you buy the seeds, there's usually a contract that you're not allowed to plant the seeds again, right? Because usually farmers have always had a traditional right to plant wheat, for example. You harvest and then you eat some of it, and some of it you save and plant the next year. But if you use Monsanto corn, you're not allowed to do that. And lately also the Monsanto corn has been genetically manipulated to not be fertile, not being able to be replanted. So you have to depend on these things. So what happens then, of course, is that there is an overproduction of chicken. The price of chicken goes down. You borrow money which you have to pay back, but you earn less with the chicken you produce. The solution to that is borrow more money and buy and invest in larger chicken farms, and hoping that you'll earn more money to be able to pay back your debt, etc. So most of the chicken farmers in the US are, in this type of debt that they can't ever pay back, and are also locked in then in this type of production cycle where you have to, whether you want or not, you have to keep producing more and more chickens that will sell cheaper. So that's the sort of a logic around, right? And the advantage of this thing, of course, is that calories are cheap, right? And explosion of the human population, famines, although they still occur, are mostly a consequence of failing distribution systems rather than the unavailability of food. Right? So you often have situations where you might have famine in a particular place, but then you have surpluses in other places, right? And it's just the fact that you're not able to get the food. And of course, a replacement of the traditional. I mean, to some extent, this is of course good, right? Because human beings have never been as well nourished as today, and never been as tall as today, right? If you look at the statistics from military conscripts, you could see that in Europe in the 1890s, the average height for a man would be about 1.55, 1 meter 55. Today, I think the average height in Europe is like 1.77. So people have become taller, more robust, live much longer, right? Life expectancy in the before the Second World War, it was still around 35, 40 years, right, for a man. Today, a man in Italy is almost 80, I think. 82, right? A woman is even more, 80, 85, 87, I think, right? So we have levels of life expectancy that we've never had before, right? At the same time, we have a transformation, of course, in the type of disease, right? So while diseases related to malnutrition are becoming less common, diseases related to overnutrition are becoming more common, right? So obesity, for example, or certain type of cancers, diabetes, all these things, right, are becoming much more common, right? And particularly, I mean, this is true, of course, in Northern Europe and the United States before everything else, but it's coming pretty quickly now also in the countries that are sort of entering into this type of consumer society, right? So India, or Thailand, or China has a big problem now with the younger generation of kids and adolescents who are, you know, disproportionately obese or have child diabetes in ways that generation before didn't have, right? Because they didn't have the type of access to cheap fast food and above all cheap sugar, right? And there is, of course, a fundamental standardization of the human diet in this way, right? On the one hand, of course, we eat an enormous amount of sugar. Sugar is something that is present almost everywhere in modern commercial food, right? So if you go to a supermarket and you, whatever type of frozen food that you find, right? Frozen pizza or chicken McNuggets or quattro salti in padella or whatever you did, it's going to contain a lot of sugar, right? Because sugar is, on the one hand, of course, it's something that human beings are genetically evolved to like. We like things that are fat and sweet. And if we didn't have any bounds, we would just eat fat sweets because it's what we're sort of. And on the other hand, sugar also is it's a flavor enhancer. Right? Pre-cooked, prepared food tend to taste a bit bland, but if you add a bit of sugar, then it's more agreeable. Right? So that's one thing. Corn, we eat an enormous amount of corn. And almost all products in the supermarket will contain corn syrup, which is a sweetener, of course. And then chicken and to some extent pork. Right? The consequences of this, of course, is that, I mean, are several, right? If you look at a cultural level, then you have a situation where since this type of industrialization of food production tend to move closer and closer to the consumer because the more aspects of the production of food that you can include within a industrial production process, the more money you can make out of the food stuff, right? So and if you combine that with the process of industrialization, where people tend to work much more than they did before, right? In the sense that it's true that working hours have gone down, right? Today we tend to work 8 hours, or today it's not really true, but the standardized idea of the industrial worker in the 70s was that he and it was a man, worked 8 hours. Right? But since then, you've had also a massive inclusion of women into the labor force, which of course is empowering in whole different ways, but it means that today you need at least 2 salaries to maintain a family. Right? Whilst in the 1960s, the male breadwinner could maintain a family with 1 salary. Right? So the number of hours that each family unit is putting in have gone up a lot. And if you add on to this, of course, also the ongoing precaritization of labor, which is, which is now a reality, right? That, you have to probably juggle multiple jobs in order to make to keep a family running. In the United States, it's quite common for middle-class people to have 2 jobs, right? And then maybe the children are working as well, and you have a day job and you have a night job, right? And if you look also at the more precarious parts of the gig economy now, you have to, maybe you work at the Amazon warehouse, and then at night you bike around to deliver or other things like that, right? So you have to keep many jobs going, which of course means that you have less time to prepare food. So there's a point of entry there for pre-prepared foodstuffs, right? Which is of course the main ways in which you make money in the food economy, because the margins, the profit margins on the production of food are very, very low, right? So many people breed chickens or grow corn that you don't really earn much money from that, right? The people who earn money in the food economy are the middlemen, right? The large distributors, like, so for example, Nestlé, who can buy cheap chicken and cheap corn and sell chicken McNuggets that you can just heat up in the oven at home, right? That's where the profit margin is there. So there becomes like you have an interest of sort of pushing this type of pre-produced food through, of course, the institution of the supermarket, technologies like the microwave oven, etc. And there's a demand for it because people have less time to create food, right? And this, of course, creates a standardization of food globally, right? So while there are still traditional food systems that remain in some parts of the world, right? Southern Italy, for example, we have, still a remaining sort of traditional idea about what you eat, but which are virtually gone in other parts of the world. Like Sweden, for example, it's a country that basically has lost its food culture, right? Also because in Sweden, women started participating in the labor market already in the 1960s. So there's like 60 years of basically the disappearance of the housewife and the affirmation of frozen food and microwave ovens, etc. Right? So nobody really remembers or knows how to make traditional Swedish foodstuffs. And the most important source of calories in Sweden, I read a couple of years ago, is 1 pasta alla bolognese, 2 kebab, and 3 Thai curry. So that's what Swedish families eat. Right? So, and that's of course are things that have come through the nexus of frozen foods and microwave, right? Because that's like and there are things like things are going in that direction also in a number of other places, right? I mean, once again, if you go to a situation like that of India, for example, right, you have a younger generation which is increasingly tempted by things like Kentucky Fried Chicken and not so much McDonald's hamburgers because it's problematic from a Hindu and a Muslim perspective, but that type of stuff with pizza and sort of things are sort of coming in very quickly. So a standardization of global food habits in a certain sense. And then of course you have the fundamental ecological consequences of this type of food economy, right? Which is I mean, on the one hand, of course, fossil fuel and global warming, this type of intensive food economy is incredibly dependent on fossil fuels and consumes a lot of fossil fuels, right? So
food miles, right?
Food miles, both the production, right, of using agricultural machinery to harvest and all these sorts of things, but also the globalization of it, right? Because also the standardization of food cultures has created a situation where the seasonality of foodstuffs has essentially disappeared, right? And consumers expect to find the same type of stuff all around the world, all around the year, right? Which means that you have, you can. So there is Marks and Spencer's fruit salads, for example, right? Apparently, there was fruit salads. They were the pineapples were grown in Central America and then sent to Thailand to be cut up in pieces and put in plastic containers, which were then shipped to the UK to be sold in Marks and Spencer stores. Right? So that stuff is fairly common, right? And because of also because of artificially low or because fossil fuels are so cheap, right? It might actually be advantageous to do, right? It may be cheaper to have Thai workers who earn less cut up the pineapple and put it in the box than to actually. So there's a number of examples of these types of globalization of food production where, as Ramon says, food miles accumulate and a particular foodstuff might actually consume more than its weight in petrol before it reaches the table. So the food economy in that sense, of course, is an important source of burning fossil.
So that's sort of what's called like distributed winter time, which is like the huge amount of basically cold chambers all around the world that serve to I think that this food in high season. Right?
Sure, refrigeration, all this sort of stuff. Now, this might, to some extent, be ending or being reversed in some way. And a lot of people, when the COVID crisis hit, a lot of people were talking about the possibility of relocalizing, right? Relocalizing production systems. Right now, there's I don't know if you've read about this, but there's an enormous logistics crisis in the world right now. So apparently the price of shipping containers have gone up tenfold. Right? So while it used to cost about $1,000 to ship a container of stuff from China to Europe, it now costs about 10,000. Right? And this is creating like severe bottlenecks in terms of cheap goods, particularly, right? So cheap electronics, processors, computer, that's also already creating problems for the automobile industry, etc. But also to some extent foodstuffs, right? So UK supermarkets, for example, which are, I mean, to some extent this is exacerbated in the UK because of Brexit and because of the problem of finding lorry drivers, which used to be from Eastern Europe and can no longer work, etc. But it's also part of this. Also, the UK food system is extremely globalized. Right? UK supermarkets are extremely dependent on importing fruit and vegetables, etc., and they're no longer getting them. Right? So the UK things have turned back to like Soviet-like conditions. You have to stand in line to buy a tomato. So that's one thing, of course. Another consequence of this, of course, is related to the the fact that these types of, there is no such thing as a free lunch, as Milton Friedman said, all these economists, right? There is always a price to pay somewhere, right? And cheap calories are, as Patel and Moore write, they're rendered artificially cheap by simply offloading their costs on something, right? So cheap corn and cheap wheat are consuming water resources in ways that can't really be replaced, right? So the underground aquifers and the waters of areas like the American Midwest are already now being consumed, right? And the estimates are that you probably can't go on growing wheat in that way for more than another decade or so, right? Because then the water will be gone, right? So there's a window of sort of natural capital, if you want to use that term, right? Or at least natural resources that you can use for a certain time, but then that ends and you can't do it. The nitrogen cycle is another thing. The artificial fertilizer is very, very rich in nitrogen, so it tends to disrupt the natural nitrogen cycle and increase the nitrogen levels in the sea, and that creates ocean acidification, so the sea becomes more acidic, and that fundamentally alters the equilibrium of marine ecosystems, so that you get fish dying out, coral reefs disappearing, and even situations where you have like essentially ocean death, right? So large parts of water that are no longer alive from this type of. And then, of course, the whole reduction of biodiversity, which is, of course, incredibly important because, on the one hand, of course, as a source of resilience, the more you have these monocrops, the less diversity there is. The less diversity means that it's more difficult to respond to systemic challenges, which are becoming more frequent with weather patterns, for example, right? And one of the cases there that you're seeing very clearly now is the decline of of the insect population of bees, right? So across Europe and America, the insect population has gone down about 60% since the 1970s.
Yeah.
So
this big silent spring.
Silent spring, yeah. And that's of course is extremely dangerous in many ways because insects, even though we might not like them, are fundamental for a whole series of functions, if not else the the decomposition of organic material and all these things. And one of the insects that are being hit the hardest, of course, are bees. Right? The bee population is going down very, very quickly, probably as a result of pesticides. Right? The number of pesticides that are out there. Of course, there's some research suggesting this, but then of course there's a lot of research financed by the people who make pesticides or trying to disprove it, etc. Right? But there is this idea that there probably is a link between pesticide use and the collapse of bee colonies. Right? And of course, bees are fundamental for pollination. Right? If you have a collapse, you already now have a decline of bees to the extent that some fruit growers now are using human labor to artificially pollinate fruit trees. Right? So you have people with like brushes going around brushing a flower here and there like that, instead of having bees because there's not enough bees. Right? And there's now ideas of creating robotic bees, which could replace real bees in the pollination. So all of these effects are, they are ticking time bombs in a certain sense, right? Once you get this type of commercial monoculture, industrialized agriculture, you get the situation where on the one hand, there's a happy initial period where you get a lot of cheap calories and food becomes cheap, etc. But then you run into the Malthusian trap again. It's only that this time the Malthusian trap is even more serious because it has to do with the transformation of the very ecological conditions that allowed you to grow food in this way in the first place. So very probably one of the areas where we're going to feel the onset of the Anthropocene, so to say, right, of these feedback mechanisms, is the food economy. Right? And in the sense that it's likely that we're going to see serious disruptions in globalized production chains and transportation chains. Right? It's likely that we're going to see serious disruptions of production, either through drought or through adverse weather patterns or through ecosystem collapse. That means that there's no resilience in relation to new type of parasites, for example. Right? If you looked at what happened in East Africa this spring and this summer, Sudan and Egypt, for example, were invaded by enormous locust swarms, right? Where that basically consumed everything in the fields. But there were some instances of this also in the American Midwest. Right? So these types of disequilibria, which create situations that you don't really have any answer for. Right? And not least pandemics, right? I mean, the origins now of the COVID pandemic are of course under debate, etc. But there's no discussion the fact that the number of viruses that have jumped from animals to human beings has intensified enormously in the last decades, right? Because and this has to do with essentially the intensification of ecological boundaries, right? I mean, let's say that you have a piece of Indonesian young jungle, right? And then that you cut down that jungle and you put up a chicken farm, right? Then there's going to be some viruses that's been in that jungle for a very long time, but nobody really cared because they were, scarce contact with human beings, etc. Right? So maybe a bat flies into the chicken co-op and takes a poop among the chickens, and then one of the chickens eats the poop and then gets infected with this virus. And of course, a chicken co-op is perfect place for incubating very viral and very deadly viruses because you have maybe 10,000 individuals that live in close proximity and that each live about 30 days, right? So there's really no incentive for the virus to go down on mortality, just sort of infect and kill as many people as possible. It doesn't really matter, right? So you get an incubator of viruses that are really viral, and then it might easily jump over to some human person who's going around there, maybe some migrant worker without protection and without living on a poor diet, etc., getting infected with this thing, and then this is stuff that is. I mean, ever since agriculture started, we've had new viruses, right? I mean, the diseases that Europeans were immune to and that devastated South America, mainly South America, but also North America, with the arrival of the conquistador in the 15th century. Battle things like measles, smallpox, etc., were diseases that Europeans were immune to because they had developed through cohabitation with farm animals. Right? And the original population of South America didn't have the same kind of farm animals, right? So they had no resistance to this. And this type of thing is probably going to become much more intense in the future. So there's a number of these type of negative feedback loops that are creating, making the system less and less sustainable. And this, of course, also means that, and that may be the theme for the rest of the course, that given that the food economy is perhaps the, so to say, the frontier where this impact on the Anthropocene is going to be felt most intensely and first, it's also the place where technological and above all social and political transformation is starting to happen, right? So one of the few social movements right now that are actually able to integrate the experience of the Anthropocene into some sort of coherent social and political philosophy are the movements that are coming out of peasant movements, right? So if you look at the whole concept of agroecology, for example, right, which has been around for about 10 years, but it's an idea which is at the heart of a number of peasant movements, particularly in South America, but also rapidly spreading around the world.
La Via Campesina.
Via Campesina, Movimento Sin Terra, and these things, right? But also Bandava Shiva in India is also very much promoting this idea, right? It's an idea that of creating a system of agriculture and a food economy, because the two things are, of course, inseparable from each other, right? Which is based on a rational management of ecological principles, which doesn't sort of go against the ecological context and try to sort of subdue it with pesticides and artificial fertilizers, etc., but try to work with it in different ways, right? Afi knows much more about this. You actually created an agroecological farm once, right? So she can explain much more about how it works, but it's essentially the idea of being able to Yeah, that's also part of it, but I mean, there's different levels. I mean, of course, on the part of agricultural technique, it's about, as far as I understand it, about combining different varieties of plants and animals and species so that there is a functioning ecological balance around it, right?
Yeah.
The circle, yes, right. Where the different, instead of having just a monoculture and then killing everything else, you create a system where these things are. But then, of course, as Afi said, also this is, of course, linked to. This is impossible to do under capitalist conditions of food production, because capitalists of food production are incentivizing or driving towards standardized monocultures, right? For reasons that we'll discuss more next week. So in order to perhaps this to become more than a niche experience, right? Something to become more than, than what hipster farmers do, or if I'm not mistaken, you created an agroecological farm for the heir of a Chinese rubber plantation family. So the daughter wants to do a little bit of agroecology on the side by White Daddy is sort of building huge monocultural
palm
palm oil farms in the jungle at the same time. Right? So palm oil, of course, being one of these most invasive monocrops right now, along with shrimp farming is another thing, which in places like Thailand and Indonesia, destroying wetlands. Salmon farming. Don't eat salmon. It's the most poisonous foodstuff in the world, farms. So this sort of stuff, it requires a different agroeconomy, right? So it requires an agroeconomy which is not oriented singly to capital accumulation, which is maybe based more on, well, some people suggest autosufficiency on the maybe more extreme layer, but at least more type of localized economies in the sense where production is more local and it's run by smaller firms that have less market power, etc. And it also presupposes different types of class relations, right? Because the type of monocrop agricultural systems are also, of course, heavily dependent on the existence of cheap labor or people who are dispossessed of, so if you look at southern Italy, for example, you have, the reason why tomatoes are so cheap, right? And the tomatoes are that you can buy, a can of tomatoes for 30 cents or something like that is, of course, that the people who pick tomatoes do so in slave-like conditions, right? Earning maybe 10, 15 euros a day for 10 hours a day. So these things, of course, need to be fundamentally transformed. And also, of course, that type of food economy is also linked to a different type of consumption, right? A lot of the people within these agricultural movements are trying to overcome the type of fundamental alienation between production and consumption that is a feature of all kind of capitalist production. We'll discuss this more next week. But the fact that, when I eat chicken McNuggets, I have no notion, I have absolutely no idea of the conditions of production behind those chicken McNuggets, right? I don't know, I've never been inside a chicken farm. I don't know the people who are grown the chickens. I don't know the illegal immigrants who've been working in the chicken slaughter factory. Right? I have no notion of that, right? The only thing I see is maybe, is the packaging and the McDonald's symbol and the McNugget and the type of lifestyle that's being, constructed around that in this place, right?
That would say that it's black box somehow.
It's black box, right? Yes, and that's the fundamental effort of commodities to black box the origins, right? You have a smartphone there. You have absolutely no idea about how that smartphone is produced and who did it and where do they find the rare metals that goes into it, etc. For you, it's a what? Samsung? It's a Samsung, right? Which is a brand, which is some sort of lifestyle to it. That's what you see. So, of course, agroecology movements are also invested in trying to break this alienation, right? And bringing consumers tighter to production. And there's a number of different ways of doing that, of course, like, farmers markets and community-based agriculture and all these sorts of things, right? And these are maybe, I'm sure Ramon is going to talk more about that further on, but these are, the food economy right now is probably one of the few areas in which, theoretical alternatives to the path leading us deeper into the Anthropocene are actually being developed, right? Much more advanced than any ideas about how to transform industrial production, right? Or how to transform energy consumption. Is it sustainable? That's another question. A lot of people in these agroecology movements are suggesting that you can actually feed the world's population using these types of alternative agricultural systems. Right? But of course, that requires a fundamental political and social transformation, right? Because as it is now, political and social systems are still favoring the commercial agroeconomy, right? Because everything from, I mean, your architects, if you just think about urban planning, for example, right? You plan for supermarkets, you don't plan for farmers markets, for example. So these are like what the basic sort of things. And although Naples not, because Naples doesn't have a lot of supermarkets, which you might have noticed. I mean, there's some of them around, but they're not as much as in Rome or Milano or in others. And that's partly because, organized crime in Naples has been very, has created a predatory environment for supermarkets, and partly because they have support from small scale sellers, traders, right? There's a lot of small markets and small shops, etc. But partly because they're also interested in supermarkets as money laundering machines, right? So there tends to be, it's very difficult for supermarkets to establish themselves here, right? And instead what you get is you get a number of these very weird supermarkets, right? Small chains that doesn't exist anywhere else and that sell things very cheap and, that are like, connected to this alternative economy in weird ways, right? But for the most of the, otherwise these things are privileged. So, and it also probably requires a different relation to food consumption, in the sense that a transformed food economy that is more resilient or sustainable probably will also mean, I think it's inevitable that it would mean that food will become more expensive. Right? Because up until the 1940s, a European worker would spend 70% of his income, family income, on food. Today, the figure is about 10%. Right? So food is artificially cheap. And it probably needs to become more expensive. That, of course, is very, very difficult to sell politically. Right? Also culturally, because cheap food is the fundamental basis of social growth. Right? And people are extremely price conscious when it comes to food. Right? So in my neighborhood, you can buy chicken breasts, like enormous chicken breasts like this. You can see that they come from these for €2 a kilo. And that's extremely persuasive. Even I buy it for €2. I don't care where it comes from. Like €2 a kilo, that's great. And most other people would be, my mother gets like hilariously happy when she, it's just €2. Buy like 10 kilos of it and put it in the freezer. Like, fantastic, right? And that's, I mean, that is a very, very strong argument. How do you convince people who are not culturally predisposed, right? Because it might be easy for Ramon and me and you, and who are like aware of this, and who, we're a little bit of hipsters, right? And we like artisan beer and pre-industrial grains and handcrafted wine, or even hand-fried potato crisps, right? So we like that sort of stuff, right? We like food that is produced by PhDs. But how do you convince people who doesn't have that cultural capital, or that doesn't come from that perspective? That is extremely difficult, I think. And that is one of the strongest trump cards, I think, that the commercial agro-business still has, right? Is it can go on and produce very, very cheap calories until it can't. It's probably like, that once again, is an argument for the dynamics of collapse, like, so in The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway, his British friend went bankrupt, and Jay Hemingway's alter ego asked him, how did you go bankrupt? And he said, first gradually, then suddenly. And that's probably quite likely also as a trajectory for how this might collapse. Right? That's all for me, I think, for now.
You guys have any questions or remarks or concerns to share?
Please read this introductory chapter also for next week, because next week we're going to talk about capitalism, and there's a lot of that in here. So, I mean, he talks about the food economy, but he also uses it as an example to talk about the development of capital. And you'll find a standardized version of this on the course website for the readings. It's a history of the world in 7 cheap things, but it's on the.
I can send you on me.
Oh, it's here, right? In the you can just download it from the course website. Here. No, okay, so there's a course website. Are you aware of this?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you go on that website, or it's like my website, not just for this course, but for all of them. If you go on that website, you will find these lectures and also the readings that you can download.
Sì. Gliel'ho mandati anche per email.
Okay.
Gli ho mandato proprio una mail qualche giorno. Dovrebbero avere.
Vabbè.
Sbagliato pensare tipo al foglio, quindi come tipo il simbolo proprio di atmosfera,
Dell'Anthropocene?
sì, dell'antropocene, non icona, non so come spiegare bene.
It's a kind of metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a kind of embodiment.
So why would it be wrong? Perché dovrebbe essere sbagliato?
No, perché se poteva considerare come una sorta di metafora per questo.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a lot of people are doing that, right? I mean, there was even this art installation that someone who suggested to I mean, completely unrealistic, but suggested to put like pink in chicken feed coloring to create this sort of pretty flare. But yes, I mean, it's like chicken, of course, is a symbol of, it's an excellent symbol of it, because in a certain sense, it's a commodity that represents this, incredible intensification of resource extraction, because that's what it is, right? In a certain sense, growing chicken is extracting ecological resources, everything from the carrying capacity of ecological systems, water resources, biodiversity, antibiotics is a big problem. Chicken and pig farms, of course, use an enormous amount of antibiotics, which is, of course, now also reaching a limit because it starts creating new families of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which a lot of people are suggesting is going to become the real killer, right? Rather than COVID and viruses, it's going to become the fact that we're going to go back to a situation where, up until the Pasteur, essentially, right? Up until the late 19th century, bacterial infection was the big killer, right? People would die from that much more than anything. And we've managed to escape that with antibiotics, but now we're much likely to get back to the situation again. Right? And this in name of the production of, of a bird, which is has been so manipulated that it's almost not natural anymore. I mean, it's difficult to say whether an industrial chicken is really, to what extent is it natural, and to what extent has it become a machine in a sense, right? A biological machine for the creation of proteins, for example, the transformation of extracted natural resources into proteins. And of course, in order to create these extremely cheap proteins, right, which are now present everywhere and which enables everybody to eat this thing, right? And in numbers that are vastly unprecedented. I mean, one could also say that, in a certain sense, from a perspective of evolutionary success, it's the chickens that are using us, right?
Yeah.
The chicken. There are so many chickens now. Maybe they live in miserable conditions, but they're, in a certain sense, you could say that they are the real evolutionary beneficiary of all of human civilization, right? There's never been chickens. Used to be birds running around, in the woodlands, right, here and there, right? But now they're like. So, I think it's an excellent signal, right? The polo chain.
Polo chain.
And it's also something that you can eat everywhere. I mean, chicken and Coca-Cola are the two foodstuffs that you can have anywhere in the world. There's no place where it's not available. Okay, well, we're going to go have some Kentucky Fried Chicken for lunch. They just opened up on the Toledo.
Okay, guys, we'll take a break and then we'll meet up at 2:15, 2:20. Okay? 1 hour break? More or less. More or less. Or like 2:30 is fine. Ok.
Le letture della settimana prossima, settimana 3, si trovano direttamente su settimana 3.
Su questo sito, allora, io magari lo mando in giro ancora una volta.
Sì, ma io intanto glielo mando ogni
Guarda,
settimana.
Trovate, you will find all the readings and everything on this course website. Okay.